So we have some news today to talk about, but I specifically want to look under the area of loot and progression. There's some really cool changes coming to how loot's going to work. Some pretty important stuff to note when it comes to trying to grind out Masterworks and Legendaries that I certainly wanted to highlight, and then just other news that you may have missed over the past couple of days. My name is Ryan Central, you can subscribe for more Anthem content, but we will start with the news that we will be getting more Masterwork components very soon. This came from a Reddit thread from the developers talking about how inscriptions work. What inscriptions do what, we did a video highlighting all of this, and for the most part I think it was about 90% correct. Some may be different, but for the most part it seems all correct. But there was an interesting bit of information that came out of there, and it came under the different rarities and strengths of inscriptions on gear. As you're seeing on screen, you can see that there are 3 major sections: minor, major and epic, each having primary and secondary stats. I do believe that the primary and secondary stats are from the same pool. It's a little bit confusing, but the developers do go over this. Effectively, they say the lower the tier, the less impact that inscription will have. The higher the tier, the higher the impact. As an example, minor primary can modify weapon damage type from 5 to 25%, but they also say that major secondary inscriptions to weapon damage would modify this from 25 to 175. Then I would assume that epic primary and secondary might increase it from 175 to 400% or whatever the biggest amount is. So each of the different rarities gives you a pool of components that you can get. So that's why legendaries can have like 400% weapon damage on them, whereas for a masterwork weapon it might go up to 175 at most. The higher the rarity, the better inscriptions that you should, in inverted commas, get on it. But this is where an interesting point was brought up, because this only applies really to weapons and gear, because weapons and gear have 4 inscriptions on them. Components, however, only have 2. There are 2 kinds of components in the game, not looking at rarities. You have universal components that you can put on your ranger, your interceptor, your colossus and your storm, and then javelin specific components such as an interceptor one, a ranger one. Then you have universal ones which apply to any of the javelins that you put it on. This could increase your melee damage, your armor, your shield, sniper rifles and shotguns. You get the idea. Here's some examples on screen. So we have examples of the 2 component types at an epic rarity. We have a component for the interceptor on the left, and we have a universal component on the right. But if you look at the inscriptions on average, when looking at different components of each type, are always better and much bigger on universal components in comparison to javelin specific ones. And that's because the universal components seem to have major inscriptions on them, and then the javelin specific ones look like they have minor inscriptions on them. In short, the inscription amount is always better on universal components in comparison to a javelin specific component at the same level. Hell, even some epic universal components have better inscription stats on them than masterwork components for specific javelin pieces, which isn't good. But also the javelin specific components have more armor and health. If you want more armor and health to survive stuff, and more specific perks to your javelin that you run in, you run javelin specific components like the one on the left. However, if you want really good inscriptions that can influence your build, you want more universal components, but you do risk having less armor and health, and also specific component perk. The devs were asked on the Reddit thread, if javelin specific components are working as intended, are they supposed to only have access to the less useful inscription pools? And Biotaliska, who is one of the head gameplay designers, Darren, that does a lot of the Masterwork perks, says that this is working as intended. The trade-off is meant to be, you take javelin specific components for the base health and armor, you take universal components for the higher primary inscriptions. It's meant to be a trade-off. By the way, we are buffing nearly all of our universal components in an upcoming patch, so they won't feel so weak if you don't happen to roll a good inscription on them, but also Masterwork versions of universals are rolling out, so there will be a lot more viable choice. This is really important to note because all of the Masterwork components in the game are javelin specific. You have 10 for the ranger, 10 for the colossus, 10 for the storm and interceptor. I don't know how many universal components there are in the game. I'm going to assume 10, but it does mean that eventually we will be getting Masterwork universal components that will not only be strong for any of the javelins that you want to run, but also because of how the system works, they should all have really good inscriptions on them, which is quite exciting. We don't don't know necessarily when these are coming in. It sounds like these Masterwork versions of Universal components are going to be rolling out soon from the way that Darren described it, but we haven't heard anything from the developers talking about whether it's confirmed to be in the next patch or later on down the line. It's one of those typical soon things, right? But we know exactly what they are, what they're going to be, and I'm just showing you a few examples of Universal components on screen as I'm talking, so you can sort of imagine what their Masterwork versions would be, the perks that they may have on top of them, and considering that you get specific weapon Universal components, that might also add a lot more synergy to weapon builds, shotguns, snipers, that kind of stuff. I really think that that might be really good for the game. But I've spoken way too much about inscriptions. It is very complicated. Effectively, it boils down to the difference between Javelin specific components and Universal ones. Javelin specific ones are good because they give specific perks to the Javelin that you're playing on, but you also will be wanting to put in a few Universal Masterwork components when they come out, because they will supplement your build a little bit more, but also give you really good inscriptions on them in comparison to the Javelin specific ones. Finally, there's a lot of information coming out on how to get better legendary drops and Masterwork drops, and I feel that a lot of this information is pretty important to know. It's a long thread, so I'll try and paraphrase. This person said that they have had 44 legendaries drop for them in the last 50 hours. At some point it stops being coincidence and there starts to be a pattern. And they go to say it's the objectives, world event objectives, stronghold objectives, any objectives where you have something in your screen say to do this or do that which rewards you with a chest. The enemies are classified differently during those with the exception of Titans, Ursics, Luminaries and Furies. Any enemy that is guaranteed to drop items. The way that the enemies are classified during the objectives is different to how they are classified in free play. In short, go into free play and kill all of the mobs that you see, but not from events. Find scar camps that aren't part of events that just have scars just laying around and stuff. You kill them, they will start to spawn elites. You kill all the elites and a legendary enforcer will drop. And he will always drop a piece of loot according to this thread. In fact, every yellow bar elite enforcer seems to drop a piece of loot in free play that is not part of a world event, not to be confused with a regular yellow bar enforcer. They then say to go to the turret mine and kill tons of elite yellow bar enforcers, but they only drop loot occasionally. So they believe that enemies in events are classified differently and have a drop or loot penalty according to them that is key here. That these mobs don't drop loot half as frequently as mobs out in the world that aren't part of an event or in a stronghold. The chest is meant to be your loot after doing these events, and in that chest will be your chance at legendaries or masterworks. He went on to say that he's ran Turret Mine 40 times and never had a legendary drop, and they specifically say to go into the dungeons in free play even when there's not an event on and just kill stuff in there, because he's managed to get 5 legendaries from fighting scorpions in the scorpion dungeon. This is one of those things that it's really hard to clarify. This is something that I'm going to spend my time probably doing on stream tonight when you see this video, if you want to check it out and see for yourself, but ultimately it does make sense. Going into free play, not doing world events, just killing everything that you see is a really important aspect in managing to get gear, because you're killing rare elites that are just wandering around that aren't part of events. Because with some specific events such as picking up ruins and putting them back into a shaper relic or doing various things around, mobs are constantly going to spawn until you complete that objective, meaning that if they did have a higher chance of dropping loot, you could just exploit this and farm these mobs that will keep spawning over and over until you finish the world quest. So that makes sense. The enemies that you would kill out in free play or in a dungeon won't keep spawning over and over again. You will clear them out and you will kill them. Can't confirm if this is 100% the case, but it's certainly worth trying out if you're really frustrated with the Masterwork and Legendary drops that you have had. I would recommend giving it a go. But on the subject of loot and progression, some really interesting interactions have happened that I wanted to highlight to show how fucked the system is. There's no way around it. It's baffling. So as you're gearing up, you hit level 30, your item level, your gear level would be at least 330, right? And then through a period of doing legendary contracts, strongholds in hard and GM1 as you're slowly transitioning into a new difficulty, because you can't just jump into a stronghold straight away and expect it to go very well. Over time you eventually gear up. Your gear level goes from 330 to about, on average, 590. You go from an epic ranger, colossus, whatever, to a masterwork one. And within the first week of Anthem coming out, Twitch streamers had it in their Twitch titles that they were a level 590 ranger, and you look at that and you go, oh, they're a high-end ranger, they have a lot of cool gear, let's check out this guy. Much like you would in World of Warcraft, where gear level and light level in Destiny gives you context in how strong that character is. The higher the gear level, the more powerful the javelin, and the more time that the player has on average sunk into that character. That's all well and good. Once you hit level 13 going into GM, you will put on any new gear that you get so long as it's more powerful. You'll just try and get your gear score up, and eventually you'll start to put on the gear that you like, start to make specific builds. Once you hit the cap of roughly what would be around 490 to 500, depending on how many Masterworks and Legendaries you have. But the problem that Anthem has is once they hit that level, of course it's capped. You can't get higher gear score than that. That's where inscriptions and min-maxing becomes important. Some of the inscriptions on gear is so bad, and everything that we went over with the universal components versus Javelin specific ones mean that you have a lot of the high tier players, some of which I know, the theory crafters that are doing GM2 and GM3 with really strong broken builds, actually having a gear score of around 450 instead of 490 to 500. And that's a big problem because they're putting on, in inverted commas, worse gear, worse rarities because it's stronger than Masterworks. And that shouldn't be the case. With any luck, the new Masterworks for universal components will help diminish this somewhat, but I still think that this is a big problem. That the players that are actually trying to progress doing the harder difficulties are reducing their gear score, which completely ruins the context of the game, right? Because people use gear score to see how strong a Javelin is. A Javelin with a gear score of 500 should be a lot stronger, do more damage, and be useful for higher progression than a Javelin with the item level of 450, but that's not the case. And this is one of the biggest issues that I think Anthem has currently. So with any luck, these new components that are added into the game do fix and alleviate this, but scaling is a bit of a mess right now. We'll talk about this a bit more specifically tomorrow. I already recorded the video, but I kind of wanted to focus on one aspect of it here. I hope you enjoyed this video, a bit more discussion-y, a bit less big update kind of news, but really important news nonetheless. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.